Today, we are going to talk about moral choices, especially the kind of decisions people are forced to make under extreme pressure. These situations are uncomfortable because there is no perfect solution. No matter what someone decides, there will be loss. That is why these situations force us to think deeply about responsibility, intention, and whether results alone are enough to decide what is right or wrong.
Yes, and one of the most famous examples used to explore this kind of moral thinking is known as the trolley problem. Imagine you are driving a trolley that is moving very fast. Suddenly, you see 5 workers standing on the track ahead. You try to stop the trolley, but the brakes do not work. If nothing changes, the trolley will hit the 5 workers and they will certainly die.
Now, imagine that, just in time, you notice another track on the right side. On that side track, there is only 1 worker. The steering wheel works, so you have the power to turn the trolley. If you turn, the trolley will kill 1 person, but the 5 workers will be saved. If you do nothing, the trolley will continue straight and kill the 5.
This is the moment that creates the moral dilemma. Many people immediately feel that saving 5 lives is better than saving 1. From this point of view, the number of lives matters most. People who think this way focus on the outcome and believe that the right action is the one that leads to the least overall harm.
However, not everyone feels comfortable with this answer. Some people pause and feel uneasy because turning the trolley means actively choosing to kill someone. Even though the result saves more people, you are still directly responsible for the death of the 1 worker. This raises an important moral question about whether intention matters as much as outcome. To explore this discomfort further, let us change the situation slightly. This time, you are not driving the trolley. Instead, you are standing on a bridge above the track. Below you, the trolley is again moving toward 5 workers and the brakes still do not work. You cannot stop the trolley by yourself. Now, imagine that a very large man is standing next to you on the bridge. If you push him onto the track, his body will stop the trolley. He will die, but the 5 workers will survive. Once again, you have the power to save 5 lives, but only by directly causing the death of another person.
What is interesting is that many people who would turn the trolley in the first situation refuse to push the man in this second situation. Even though the final result is the same, the action feels much more disturbing. This shows that moral judgment is not based only on numbers or outcomes.
One important reason for this difference is the idea of direct action. Pushing someone with your own hands feels like a personal act of violence. In contrast, turning a steering wheel feels more indirect. For many people, directly causing harm feels morally heavier than allowing harm to happen as a side effect.
This brings us to an important distinction between 2 ways of thinking about morality. The first is called consequentialist thinking. This approach says that morality depends on consequences. According to this view, the right action is the one that produces the best overall result, such as saving the greatest number of lives.
The second approach is often called categorical or duty-based thinking. This view argues that some actions are wrong no matter how good the outcome might be. From this perspective, killing an innocent person is always wrong, even if doing so could save many others.
These 2 ways of thinking often lead to very different conclusions. In the trolley problem, consequentialist reasoning supports saving the 5 workers. Duty-based reasoning may reject any action that intentionally kills 1 person, even if more lives are saved.
To understand this conflict more clearly, imagine another situation. You are a doctor working in an emergency room. 6 patients arrive after a serious accident. 5 patients have moderate injuries and will survive if you treat them quickly. 1 patient is critically injured and needs all of your time to survive.
If you spend all day treating the critically injured patient, the other 5 will die. If you treat the 5 patients instead, the 1 critically injured patient will die. In this case, many people believe the doctor should save the 5, again focusing on the outcome rather than the individual loss.
Now, consider a different medical case. You are a transplant surgeon. 5 patients will die without organ transplants. In another room, there is 1 healthy person who came in for a routine checkup. If you take that person's organs, he will die, but the 5 patients will live. Almost everyone feels that this action would be morally wrong. Even though 5 lives could be saved, killing a healthy person feels unacceptable. This reaction shows that people care deeply about how an action is carried out, not just about the result it produces. Another idea that often appears in these discussions is consent. Some people ask whether an action becomes acceptable if the person who is harmed agrees to it. However, consent in extreme situations is difficult to evaluate because fear, pressure, and lack of alternatives can influence decisions.
There's also the concept of fairness. Many people feel that tragic outcomes are easier to accept when the decision process is fair. For example, some believe that a random lottery is more just than choosing someone based on usefulness, strength, or social value, even if the result is still tragic.
All of these examples show us that moral reasoning is complex. People consider consequences, intentions, fairness, consent, and responsibility at the same time. Different people prioritize these values differently, which explains why moral disagreements are so common and persistent. Philosophers have been debating these questions for hundreds of years. One important philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, argued that morality should aim to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. This idea is known as utilitarianism and represents a clear form of consequentialist thinking. Another influential philosopher, Immanuel Kant, strongly disagreed with this approach. He believed that morality is based on duties and rights, not outcomes. According to his view, people should never be treated merely as a means to an end, even if the end seems beneficial.
These philosophical ideas are not just abstract theories. They influence real-world decisions in law, medicine, public policy, and everyday life. When societies decide how to punish crimes or handle emergencies, these moral principles quietly shape those choices.
For English learners, discussing topics like this is also extremely valuable. It helps you practice expressing opinions, explaining reasons, and understanding complex ideas using simple and clear language. You do not need advanced vocabulary to discuss deep questions.
As you listen and reflect, notice your own reactions to these situations. Ask yourself which choices feel right to you and why. Moral thinking is not about finding easy answers, but about learning how to reason carefully and listen to different perspectives without rushing to conclusions.
We can continue developing these ideas further by examining more real-life cases, exploring how society judges such decisions, and discussing how moral reflection can change the way we see ourselves and others as this conversation moves forward naturally into the next part.
As we move forward from where we paused, it is important to think about what happens after these moral decisions are made. Even when people believe they chose the least harmful option, they often continue to question themselves for years. Feelings like guilt, doubt, and emotional discomfort do not disappear just because a decision seemed logically correct at the time.
Yes, and this emotional aftermath shows us that morality is not only about logic or rules. Moral decisions affect how people see themselves. After a difficult choice, many people ask, "What kind of person am I now?" This question can be heavier than asking whether the outcome was good or bad.
This concern about identity explains why some people refuse to take action in moral dilemmas. They fear becoming someone who can justify harming another human being. Even if the situation is extreme, they worry that once a moral line is crossed, it may become easier to cross another one later.
Another important factor is how society judges these decisions after they happen. People who survive extreme situations are often judged by others who were never in danger themselves. These observers have the comfort of distance and safety, which can make their judgments feel confident but also incomplete.
Exactly, and this creates tension between understanding and judgment. Some people believe morality should always consider circumstances, while others believe strong rules are necessary to protect society. If we excuse too much, we risk justifying harmful behavior. If we excuse too little, we risk being cruel to human suffering.
This brings us to the rule of moral rules. Rules exist to guide behavior, especially when emotions are strong. However, in extreme situations, rules can feel insufficient or even unrealistic. People then face a painful conflict between following a rule and responding to immediate human need.
This conflict appears in many professions. Doctors, soldiers, judges, and emergency workers often face situations where no option is fully right. Their decisions are shaped by training, laws, expectations, and personal values all at once. Moral clarity is rare in these moments.
Another key idea is the difference between intention and foresight.
Some people argue that intending harm is morally worse than simply knowing harm will happen. For example, causing harm as a side effect may feel less blameworthy than causing harm as a goal.
However, critics argue that if you know harm will happen and you act anyway, you still carry responsibility. From this view, foresight does not remove moral accountability. This disagreement shows how deeply people differ and how they assign blame.
Responsibility itself is a complex concept. Does responsibility depend on control, choice, knowledge, or outcome? In moral dilemmas, people often lack full control and complete information. This uncertainty makes moral judgment fragile and open to debate.
Uncertainty is central to moral life. Decisions are often made without knowing the future. People act based on limited information, fear, and hope. Judging these actions later, when outcomes are clear, can be unfair because it ignores the uncertainty present at the moment of choice.
This is why moral humility matters. Recognizing the limits of our knowledge helps us judge others more gently. It also allows us to reflect on our own actions without turning reflection into endless self-blame.
Reflection should help us learn, not punish ourselves. Moral growth comes from understanding patterns in our thinking and behavior, not from constantly reliving regret. Learning happens when reflection leads to insight rather than shame.
We should also talk about emotion. Some people believe emotions interfere with moral reasoning, but others argue that emotions provide important information. Empathy helps us recognize suffering that numbers and calculations alone cannot capture.
Empathy is an important moral skill. It helps us understand the impact of our actions. For most people, it is not enough to think about morality. They also need to feel it to some extent.
Emotions are not enemies of morality. They act as signals. The challenge is balance. Too much emotion can overwhelm judgment, while ignoring emotion can lead to cold and harmful decisions. Moral wisdom often lies between these extremes.
This balance develops over time. Moral maturity does not mean having perfect answers. It means being able to hold complexity without panic. It means accepting that sometimes all choices are painful, yet still taking responsibility for action.
Many people expect morality to feel clear and confident. In reality, deep moral questions often create discomfort. That discomfort is not weakness, it is a sign that the question truly matters.
Stories play an important role in moral learning. We often understand morality through examples rather than rules. Stories help us imagine ourselves in difficult situations and feel the weight of decisions before making judgments.
That is why moral education often begins with cases and dilemmas. Stories engage our moral imagination. They remind us that behind every decision are real people, real fears, and real consequences.
These stories stay with us long after technical arguments fade. They shape our instincts and influence how we respond to future situations, even when we are not consciously thinking about philosophy.
Over time, repeated reflection builds a moral framework that quietly guides our actions. This framework is shaped by culture, experience, and dialogue. That is why thoughtful discussion is so valuable.
For English learners, discussions like this also strengthen language skills. Talking about abstract ideas in simple English builds clarity and confidence. It proves that meaningful ideas do not require complicated vocabulary.
Speaking slowly and clearly creates space for thinking. It allows listeners to reflect instead of just hearing words. This pace supports both language learning and deeper understanding.
As we continue, notice how your reactions change. Do you feel more certain, more confused, or more thoughtful? All of these responses are normal. Moral understanding grows through
As we
questioning,
continue,
not through rushing
it is important to think
conclusions.
about how moral disagreement
is not
functions
failure.
in a healthy society. When people disagree deeply about right and wrong, the challenge is not simply to win arguments, but to live together despite those differences. Moral discussion becomes a practice in listening, patience, and restraint rather than domination. Yes, and this is where dialogue matters more than certainty. When people enter moral discussions believing they already have all the answers, conversation shuts down.
But when people approach with curiosity, they create space for learning. This openness does not weaken moral conviction. It makes it more reflective and responsible.
Another aspect worth considering is moral luck. Sometimes people are judged not for their intentions, but for how events turn out. Two people may make similar choices under pressure, yet only one faces tragic consequences. Society often judges them differently, even though the decision-making process was nearly the same.
That is a powerful point. Moral luck reminds us that outcomes are not always fully under our control. This challenges the idea that morality should be judged only by results. It forces us to ask whether fairness requires looking at intention and circumstance, not just what happened in the end.
This idea becomes especially important in legal systems. Courts must decide whether to focus on actions, intentions, or consequences. Law cannot fully capture moral complexity, yet it must draw clear lines. This tension explains why legal judgments sometimes feel morally unsatisfying.
And yet, without law, moral chaos would follow. Rules protect society by setting boundaries. Even when rules seem harsh in individual cases, they serve a larger purpose. The challenge is designing systems that protect principles without ignoring human reality.
This brings us back to the conflict between compassion and justice. Compassion urges us to understand suffering, while justice demands consistency. Neither value alone is sufficient. A moral society must constantly negotiate between these two forces.
Negotiation is the key word here. Moral reasoning is not about discovering a single final rule. It is about ongoing adjustment as new situations arise. History shows us that moral understanding evolves through struggle, debate, and reflection.
We can see this evolution clearly when we look at past moral beliefs. Practices once considered acceptable are now condemned. This change did not happen because people became smarter overnight, but because moral reflection exposed hidden suffering and injustice.
And this historical awareness should make us humble. Some of our current moral beliefs may one day be questioned. Recognizing this possibility keeps us open to criticism and growth rather than defensive certainty.
Another important element is responsibility to future generations. Moral decisions do not only affect those involved immediately, they shape norms, expectations, and examples that influence others later. This long-term impact adds another layer of moral responsibility.
Yes, actions signal values. When society excuses certain behaviors, it teaches future generations what is acceptable. This is why moral decisions carry symbolic weight beyond their immediate effects.
At the same time, we must be careful not to demand moral heroism from everyone. Expecting people to always act perfectly under extreme pressure ignores human limits. Moral systems must be realistic as well as aspirational.
This realism is crucial. Morality that ignores human weakness becomes cruel. Morality that ignores standards becomes meaningless. The balance between these extremes defines ethical maturity.
I also want to highlight the role of reflection after action. People often revisit their decisions repeatedly, imagining alternatives. While some reflection is healthy, endless self-judgment can be damaging. Moral reflection should aim to understand, not destroy. Healthy reflection asks what can be learned, not who deserves punishment. It transforms experience into wisdom rather than trauma. This approach allows people to grow even after painful choices. This growth is rarely comfortable. Moral learning often involves discomfort, doubt, and uncertainty. But avoiding these feelings does not protect us, it limits us. Growth requires facing difficult questions honestly. That honesty applies to language as well. Expressing moral ideas clearly requires slowing down, choosing words carefully, and accepting imperfection. This process mirrors moral reasoning itself. For learners listening, notice how complex ideas can be explained using simple structures. Moral clarity comes from careful thinking, not complicated vocabulary. This is encouraging for anyone developing language skills. Simple language does not mean simple thought. It means disciplined thought. It means choosing clarity over performance, understanding over impression. As we move forward, we will continue building on these ideas without closing them prematurely. Moral questions deserve time. They unfold gradually, just like understanding grows gradually through repeated reflection. Yes, and we will continue from here, keeping the same tone, same depth, and same flow, allowing each idea to connect naturally to the next as this discussion continues.
I want to focus on how moral reasoning shapes personal character over time. Repeated engagement with difficult questions does something subtle but powerful. It trains us to pause before reacting, to consider perspectives beyond our own, and to accept responsibility even when certainty is impossible. These habits slowly become part of who we are.
Yes, morality is not only about individual decisions, but about forming dispositions. A person who regularly reflects on consequences, intentions, and fairness develops a kind of moral reflex. This reflex does not guarantee correct choices, but it increases the likelihood of thoughtful ones, especially under pressure.
This is why moral education matters, even when it feels abstract. It is easy to dismiss philosophical discussion as impractical, but these conversations shape how we respond instinctively in real situations. When time is limited and emotions are strong, we rely on habits formed earlier through reflection and dialogue.
And these habits also affect how we judge others. A reflective person is less likely to rush to condemnation. Instead, they ask questions about context, intention, and limitation. This does not mean excusing harm, but it does mean resisting simplistic moral labels.
Another important issue is moral responsibility within groups. Many decisions are made collectively, yet responsibility often feels diffuse. People may say, "I was just following orders," or "everyone agreed." Moral reasoning challenges us to examine individual responsibility even within collective action.
This is especially relevant in institutions such as governments, corporations, and militaries. Systems can obscure responsibility, making harmful outcomes feel inevitable or impersonal. Moral reflection helps individuals recognize their role within larger structures.
At the same time, we must acknowledge that individuals often face real constraints. Power, authority, and economic pressure limit freedom. Moral judgment must account for these constraints without denying agency altogether.
This balance is difficult. Too much emphasis on constraint removes responsibility. Too much emphasis on agency ignores reality. Moral maturity lies in holding both together without collapsing into extremes.
I also want to touch on moral fatigue. Constant exposure to difficult decisions and suffering can exhaust people emotionally. When this happens, people may disengage morally, choosing indifference as a coping strategy.
That disengagement is understandable, but it carries risks. Indifference allows harmful systems to persist unchallenged. Moral reflection, when done carefully, should energize rather than paralyze, helping people act within their limits.
This is why self-compassion is essential. Moral seriousness does not require constant guilt. It requires honesty, care, and the willingness to continue learning. Without compassion for oneself, moral reflection becomes unsustainable.
Self-compassion also supports compassion for others. When people accept their own imperfections, they become more patient with those of others. This patience is crucial for dialogue in diverse societies.
Diversity itself raises important moral questions. Different cultures prioritize different values, such as community, autonomy, honor, or harmony. Moral reasoning helps us navigate these differences without assuming one perspective is automatically superior.
Yes, moral disagreement across cultures does not always mean moral failure. Sometimes it reflects different historical experiences and social needs. Understanding this reduces conflict and encourages cooperation.
However, respect for diversity does not mean moral silence. Some practices cause clear harm. Moral reasoning helps us articulate objections without resorting to arrogance or hostility.
That articulation matters. How we express moral disagreement can either escalate conflict or invite understanding. Language becomes a moral tool, not just a communicative one.
This connects directly to the way we have structured this conversation. Slow speech, simple language, and careful pacing allow ideas to be absorbed rather than forced. This approach respects the listener's capacity to reflect.
And it also respects the complexity of the topic. Moral questions resist compression. They need space, repetition of ideas in new forms, and time for listeners to process.
As we conclude, I want to emphasize that moral reasoning is not about reaching final answers. It is about developing the capacity to live thoughtfully amid uncertainty. This capacity supports better decisions, deeper empathy, and more responsible participation in society.
I agree. The value lies in the process itself. Even when conclusions differ, shared reflection builds mutual understanding. That understanding is essential for any community that hopes to live together peacefully.
For our listeners, especially those learning English, engaging with content like this offers dual benefits. You practice language skills while also practicing reflection, patience, and clarity of thought. You do not need perfect grammar or advanced vocabulary to engage with serious ideas. What matters is sincerity, attention, and the willingness to think carefully. As you continue your learning journey, try applying this approach to other topics. Speak slowly, choose simple words, and focus on expressing meaning rather than sounding impressive.
And remember that growth, whether moral or linguistic, happens gradually. Progress may feel slow, but consistency matters more than speed.
We hope this discussion has encouraged you to think more deeply about moral choices and more confidently about expressing complex ideas in simple English.
We thank you for staying with us through this conversation. If you found it valuable, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who enjoy thoughtful discussion and English learning.
We look forward to continuing these conversations with you in future videos.
Until next time, keep thinking carefully, listening openly, and practicing your English with confidence.